Welcome for an excursion around the old city of Athens. I call this long walk a walk around the rock, because today we are going to be walking around the base of the Acropolis, that high city, that huge plug of limestone and marble that is the heart and center of ancient and modern Athens. We are going to start at the east end, underneath that flapping flag, which carries the colors of modern Greece. High above our heads, we'll be down on the level of the main city at a little square whose centerpiece is the monument of Lysicrates, the world's oldest monument in the Corinthian style. This square marks a conjunction of a number of streets. They all come together at a place where, surging up from below the pavement, is the plinth, and then on top of that, this fabulous circular monument that was put up by a man named Lysicrates. He was a naval hero as well as a choregos, a sponsor of theatrical shows, a producer, as we would call him in modern Broadway parlance, and for his winning team in a competition among choruses, he erected this victory trophy. The monument of Lysicrates is one of those real must-see spots in Athens, charming not only for this beautiful little monument itself, with its circle of Corinthian columns and its frieze above them, on which you see the subject of the song that won the contest. It was a song about a myth in which Dionysus, kidnapped by pirates, turns the pirates into dolphins, takes over their ship, and sails off with it to spread the cult of Dionysus, the vine, theatrical performances, and song all over the world. That is the dimly seen today set of figures around the upper rim. Now we are going to spend a little time here in this square, so full of life. It's surrounded by those places you can buy replicas and souvenirs. I'm recommending here that you buy some that show theatrical masks. The masks not just of tragedy and comedy, but of different stock characters from Athenian plays that were souvenirs in antiquity, and that this would be a good place for you to make a souvenir of your own visit to Athens. We are, of course, in a place that commemorates the theater and the dramas and the songs sung to Dionysus. This is also a good place to pick up some refreshment for your walk around the rock. I've had the best fried potatoes ever tasted in my life in this square. But get something you can carry with you. Get some nuts, what we would think of as trail mix, for our long walk that lies ahead of us. The little monument here, which was built in Athens at the time of Alexander the Great in the 320s, is more than just a beautiful spot. It's this focal point, as I said, for a number of streets that are running away into the old part of Athens, the part called Plaka, P-L-A-K-A, and that dominates the north side and east side of the land around the Acropolis. What I'd like you to do to begin with is get yourself up against the iron railing that surrounds that lovely little monument of Lysicrates and look down the street that is called Lysikratou, after Lysicrates himself. In the gap at the bottom of the street, you will see the endless torrent of traffic and the tram lines that carry the major road, the artery of Athens, around the east side of the historic district. On the other side of that street, beyond the traffic, you will see a grand and glorious monument, a sort of gateway. It's called the Arch of Hadrian. In the year 131 of our era, the Roman Emperor Hadrian, who loved Greece and Greek culture and the Athenians above all, more than any other Roman emperor, he came to the city for his second visit, and he decided to beautify this city with what we would call government grants. He was pumping into Athens, which was by then no longer any sort of naval power or political power in the world, but just a quiet university town. He pumped into it from the Roman treasury extraordinary gifts, and to sort of mark with his own name these gifts, he had this arch erected. On the arch side that faces us was the inscription, "This is the city of Theseus," meaning this is ancient Athens, the Athens founded by the hero Theseus way back in the Bronze Age, that hero who went off to Crete and fought the Minotaur in the labyrinth. But on the far side of the monument, it says, "This is the city of Hadrian." And it was the gateway to a whole set of Roman monuments, many of which are now gone, that climaxed with a monument that you should by all means visit out beyond that gateway, the Temple of Olympian Zeus. Zeus here not so much for the Olympic Games down in the Peloponnese as for Mount Olympus, that home of the gods in northern Greece. This temple had been started more than 700 years before Hadrian's own time by the tyrants of Athens back in the 6th century BC. But they had started on too grand a scale. The temple would have been bigger than the Parthenon. And so they gave up. And it languished unfinished for centuries until Hadrian came along and, with the wealth of the Roman Empire behind him, decided to complete it, not in the original Doric style, but in the much newer Corinthian style. And you'll still see about a dozen of those towering Corinthian columns, the tallest columns in Athens, that marked the spot of Hadrian's temple to Olympian Zeus. What happened to that temple? It's worth pausing here to think about the fate of so many of the antiquities of classical Athens. Many of those marble statues and columns and parts of temples ended up in lime kilns, those furnaces which burn limestone or marble to make plaster and cement. And specifically, some of the temples, like the Temple of Olympian Zeus, lost columns to the effort during the Ottoman Turkish period to make lime for mosques. And there is a surviving mosque not far from the Temple of Olympian Zeus, which is known to contain the spolia, the remains of that extraordinary temple from Hadrian's time. Now we're going to head south on the little road that leads right down to the big landmark of modern Athens, the Grand Promenade. When the Athenians were getting ready for the 2004 Olympics, they decided that their center city needed a more tourist-friendly and indeed Athenian citizen-friendly way to get around it. So they widened streets, tore down houses, and built a gigantic promenade paved in stones from the islands of Naxos and Tinos that ran all the way around most of the Acropolis. And the Athenians have taken this to their heart as a strolling place. You'll see street artists there, vendors of souvenirs and of refreshments, families out taking strolls. Join the throng because this is going to be our walkway for most of our tour around the rock. When we get down to the Grand Promenade itself, I want you to take a moment to look left, back in the direction of the big arterial road and Hadrian's buildings on the other side of it. Because if you stroll down there, it's only about a block, you can pay tribute to the statue of a great Athenian. Her name is Melina Mercouri, no longer living, but made a name for herself early in her career as a great actress of both comedies and tragedies, probably best known to English-speaking audiences for her roles in the two films Topkapi and, above all, Never on Sunday, in which she plays a Greek working woman who is taught by an American classicist the meaning of all the tragedies that she has enjoyed going to see in the Odeon of Herodotus Atticus, which we will visit, and is distressed to learn that the curtain calls were not, in fact, the happy endings, but just the actors themselves coming out for a bow, an unforgettable moment. I think sort of as a goodwill gesture to the populace, the Greek government decided to appoint her the Minister of Culture, and a new Melina Mercouri emerged. She suddenly showed a deep passion for her country, for its antiquities, for the glories of ancient Greece. She became the chief warrior in a battle to get those Elgin marbles, those marbles from the Parthenon that were taken away to England in the early 1800s and are now housed in the British Museum. Melina Mercouri led the charge in trying to get them back. She was the one who articulated what is, to my mind, the best argument for restoring those statues. If anyone asks you what you think, I would say, I agree with Melina Mercouri. Any statue that is part of an architectural monument, a temple, a cathedral, some other work on a grand scale, any of those artworks belong with that monument. It's a very simple creed. She articulated it. She fought tirelessly throughout her life to get those marbles back. She is the one who really nailed down the rationale for bringing statues home to their countries of origin. Now, having paid our respects to Melina, let's turn on to the Grand Promenade. As we stroll back the way we've come, we'll see first on our left the Acropolis Metro Station. This is my chance to give a plug for Athens Metro, both as a means of getting around the city in beautiful style and rubbing shoulders with thousands of Athenians who use it every day, but also as a place where down in the metro stations, the antiquities that were found when they dug the stations have been enshrined in museums, people's museums, museums that are passed by tens of thousands of people every day, far more than visit the more famous antiquities in the National Museum of Athens. Among the metro stations I recommend visiting are two that you can get to in a short hop from the Acropolis Metro Station. First of all, Monastiraki Station, where the Eridanos River, which used to run at ground level in Athens, can still be seen trickling through the metro station with hundreds of years worth of Greek and then Roman viaducts, embankments, structures of brick and stone all around it, carrying you back in a time machine to when Athens really had visible rivers. The other station that I would recommend is the Syntagma Square, the Constitution Square station outside the Grand Hotel Britannia and the Constitution or Parliament building at the head of the square. This ran into the most incredible array of different kinds of archaeological remains, ranging from tombs of individual Athenians to entire aqueducts that had run underground, laid down in the 6th century BC by the tyrants to bring the waters from the distant Lykavetos or Lykabetos hill all the way down to the Agora, the marketplace of Athens. So treat yourself, go down in these metro stations, even if you don't need a ride, to see some of the most exciting museums in Athens. Now we are ready for our first major monument on our walk. On your left is the Acropolis Museum, which you must visit during your time in Athens to see all of those extraordinary treasures that were found around the Parthenon and the other monuments up on the Acropolis. But we are bound for a monument that relates to our first monument, a monument in honor of the god Dionysus, the man who inspires song, choruses, plays. We're going to the Theater of Dionysus, there on the south slope of the Acropolis itself. Dionysus is a very unusual god, as gods go around the world. He is a god of the grape, he is the god of wine, he is the god of intoxication, he is the god of altered states, and let's face it, every time an actor puts on a mask, that's an altered state. And that's the rationale for making Dionysus god of the theater. When you enter the Theater of Dionysus today, you will see that open space, that circular or semicircular space called the orchestra. We've taken it over for a very different meaning in our time, but that means to the ancient Greeks a dance floor, because dancing also in an ecstatic way puts people in an altered state, and that was the heart and soul of every Dionysiac theater. Originally, there would have been an altar to Dionysus in the middle of that orchestra, that open circular space. Sometimes the playwrights worked that altar into their plays, as when sacrifices are made in the course of a play, and the actors or the chorus would have pretended to lay offerings on that altar. There would also have been chairs in a semicircle on the front row, which would have included the grand and glorious chair, which you can still see for the high priest of Dionysus in Athens, and a place to set up the god's statue, which on days when plays were shown in the Theater of Dionysus, the statue was actually brought from his temple, carried through the streets in a procession, and placed there so that the god himself could watch the show. The Theater of Dionysus in Athens is one that it's easy to get worked up about, because the greatest surviving dramatic pieces from Athens, both tragedies and comedies, are by the big four ancient playwrights, all Athenians. Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, tragic plays. Aristophanes, comic plays. But before you get too worked up and start kissing the stones as if they were holy relics, let me explain. This building was built long after those men died. In fact, at the time when they wrote, in the high classical period of the 5th century BC, the theater was probably rectangular. much smaller, and we know early on was just wooden bleachers around a sort of rectangular stage area. In the theater of Dionysus that we see today, the classic semicircular form has evolved for the seats. You've got a stage building of which we only have the lower portion today, where the actors made their entrances and exits up on a stage, and then those side wings, the paradoi, the places where the chorus comes in and out. The main show, we need to realize for many of the people, as in a Broadway show, was the chorus, which sang and danced in more glorious, flamboyant costumes. Now is the time for you to get out those raisins and nuts that you bought back in the square of the little monument of Socrates, because the way an Athenian audience expressed delight or rage over a show or disapproval was by throwing things at the actors, flowers if they were happy, nuts and raisins if they weren't. They would pelt the performers with these things rather than rotten tomatoes or eggs, as we sometimes hear in the English convention. And I don't actually recommend that you do it, but just as you eat your nuts and raisins, think about what it would be like under the hot sun, sitting there, because of course they had no lighting at night. It was all done during the day, and enjoying your little snack as you sat through a whole day's worth of 3 or 4 plays all in a row, given at one of the great dramatic festivals of Dionysus. Now back onto our grand promenade, walking along that south slope of the Acropolis to our next great entertainment center, the Odeon of Herodes Atticus. This is a towering facade of Roman arches and vaults, and we've already seen this Odeon from the top of the Acropolis steps, if we have already been up to the Acropolis, looking down into it. Now we're going to approach it as an audience member would of ancient Athens, coming up to it from the rear, entering this grand place, 34 tiers of seats. This not a theater for plays, this a place of hearing, Odeon, a place for listening to music and to recitations. Every ancient Greek community of any size would have an Odeon, and of course it's given our age a name for a kind of a theater. This Odeon is the grandest of them all. It's speculated that although normally Odeons were roofed, this one couldn't have been. Usually there would be great cedar beams holding up a roof, but this gigantic space over the 34 tiers of seats, the huge stage, the lofty height of that building behind the stage on which people would have sung, strumming their lyres and singing classical songs and so on to their Athenian audiences, and where even today the 3 tenors, or no longer Maria Callas, have performed, and where you yourself should definitely buy a ticket if you're there during one of the summer music festivals and can get in there. Even today, all this music goes on in this Odeon with its incredible acoustics. The question is, for me as an archaeologist, was it roofed? We know that normally every Odeon was roofed. The spans are not inconceivable for the cedar beams and the wooden architecture and engineering of ancient times. I'd like to give the Athenians the benefit of the doubt and assume that Herodes Atticus, who put this up in about 160 of our era in memory of his wife, Regilla, he was the richest man in the Roman Empire. He was a purveyor of materials to the Roman legions and had grown rich in the process. I'm betting he was able to get that roof on that Odeon, which makes it even more extraordinary to sit there and picture it as it must have been once in all of its glory. Now we are going to continue around the western end of the Acropolis, the sort of nose of the Acropolis. To our right, the steps are going up to the Propylaea and the entryway to the Acropolis above. But we're going to be taking in some viewing places, 2 on our left, 1 on our right toward the Acropolis as we go around this west end. First of all, there is the hill of the monument of Philopappos on our left. This is very rarely visited, and I urge you to get up on these high places. You will be almost on eye level back to the Parthenon if you want the single most spectacular image, both for your memory and for your camera, of the monuments of the Acropolis. Get up there by the monument of Philopappos, this Syrian who in the 3rd century BC gave so much money to Athens that they allowed him to erect a great monument to himself there, and get the view from there. And finally, if we want to see the beginnings of the workings of democratic government in Athens, we've got 2 more viewing points. The one on the left that we come to next is the Pnyx That means the place of the crowd. It's a hilltop that was crowned with the spot where the assembly of democratic Athens, all those adult male citizens, would meet usually about 3 times a month for their deliberations, their voting on bills, their hearing of proposals for the city's government and for its overseas policy. And you can actually see, though unfortunately no longer stand on, the bema, B-E-M-A, the speaker's platform, where some of the giants of Athenian history, the Pericles and his successors, all took their place to address the crowd. That gives you another great view back to the Acropolis, and we are told that the orators of ancient Athens loved to point back to the city's monuments behind them as they evoked patriotic feelings in their hearers. Remember, this is an outdoor deliberation. As a dear friend of mine, John Camp, likes to say, it was like the Sermon on the Mount. They stood up on the bema, high up on stone steps, and the crowd was below them, spread out on the slope, and beyond the crowd, there was the Acropolis. There was the fantastic facade of the Parthenon. The Pnyx is the place of the people, the demos. But our third viewing place, in addition to Philopapos, the Pnyx, number 3 would be the Areopagus Rock. That means the hill of Ares. He's a god we don't hear about much. He doesn't have many temples of his own. He's a son of Zeus and Hera, who is the god of war. And the Greeks, to their credit, warlike though they were, did not make much of his cult. Nonetheless, this hill was named for him, and don't go up it unless you do have non-skid shoes. Of all the slippery places in the entire Greek world, the rock of the Areopagus is the worst. Nonetheless, when you are up there, it's very exciting to think you are in a place where Paul, the apostle, was summoned to talk to the Council of Areopagus. They are usually in opposition to the democratic majority of the assembly. They are the old council of aristocrats. And it was they who wanted this visitor from far off in Judea and Asia Minor to come to them and talk to them about his religious preachings. He gave up on the Athenians when they found out that they were quite willing to welcome this new god as they had welcomed every other god through history. Having descended from the Areopagus and keeping in our mind the views we have had from that rock, not only back up to the Acropolis, but down into this distant space, the Agora, the marketplace of Athens, at the foot down there. We're going to continue on our grand promenade now down the hill. Maybe you're hungry by this time. There are buildings on your left now which have cafes at street level and often rooftop restaurants. And if you want a lunch or dinner with one of the most unforgettable views you will ever have, climb the narrow stairs, get up on those rooftops. You will enjoy that view along with your good Athenian meal. And this is a good place to get your moussaka, your olives, all of those fried cheeses like saganaki and the other delicious spinach and cheese concoctions that make up modern Greek cuisine. It's also a good place to sit if you just want something to drink and have the classic Greek cooling summer drink, a frappe. It's made of Nescafe, ice, milk, and a little sugar, and a little whirring blade that stirs the whole thing up to a froth. And believe me, it is one of the most restorative drinks you can possibly have on your walk around the rock. At the bottom of the hill, straight ahead and slightly to the left, is the old potter's quarter of Athens, the Kerameikos. And you can hear that word ceramic in the word Kerameikos. This was originally a working place. What made Athens rich to begin with? All that fine clay that the Eridanos and the other slow-moving, sluggish rivers brought down from the surrounding hills and layered around the city of Athens. It made some of the finest pottery ever created on this earth. The Athenians became geniuses at firing the pottery, sometimes twice at different temperatures and with different sort of reducing situations in terms of oxygen, so they could make out of that single mass of clay both the glowing red and the vibrant black that made up classic Athenian red and black pottery. The potters worked here. They made Athens rich all the way back into the Dark Ages, all the way back to the Mycenaean time. This potter's quarter was busy, but ultimately it became taken over for a new function. It became the public burying ground of Athens. As you enter the Kerameikos today, you find yourself in a very different environment. It's sunk below the level of the modern streets as the buildup of centuries has grown up around it. You feel the city and all of its bustle drop away, and you see the monuments of tombs, mainly now in plaster casts, placed along the old streets, the Sacred Way, and you see that gigantic dipylon or double gate, which is one of the biggest gates of the ancient world. This was the beginning of the Sacred Way that led out to Plato's Academy, outside the city. It was the beginning of the section of the Sacred Way that went up the Acropolis, and that the sacrifices, the wooden ship on wheels, the peplos that the young girls had woven for Athena as her birthday gift on the first day of the summer month, Hekatombeon, the parade started here at the Dipylon Gate. It's a fabulous little museum put up by the German Archaeological Society with all of the tomb sculptures inside that museum, as well as some of the treasures from inside those tombs. I recommend it as a dazzling moment shared by very few who go to Athens. You're off the beaten track here, and yet I think you will find a great refreshment of spirit to see some of these grave monuments of dead Athenians from long ago. But our big event of the day lies ahead. The Agora, the open space, the market of classical Athens. The Agora is a civic center, a political center, a market, a gathering place for all the adult male citizens to come together and talk through the day as they love to do. It was the heart of Athens. The average citizen spent far more time here than ever up on the top of the Acropolis. And as we enter the gates of the Agora, we see that it is a place that later people, after the age of classical Athens, were making gifts to. Our view's dominated on our left by the Stoa of Attilos II. That's a reconstructed building with long colonnades, and that is a building that was given by a king of Asia Minor to the Athenians and has been reconstructed in the 20th century. We'll save it for the end of our trip. Let's look straight ahead, and we see some white marble giants on columns standing in front of us. They are gifts from the good friend and son-in-law of the Emperor Augustus, first emperor of Rome, whose rule over Athens began officially, as for the rest of his empire, in the year 27 BC. His friend, Agrippa, gave that set of statues to be part of the facade of his own Odeon, long before Herodotus Atticus built the giant one that we've already visited. Those poor, lonely giants are all that are left, but they lead us into a very difficult site. And I'll just say this from the beginning. The Agora was hit very hard. Most of the upper structures of its buildings have been taken away and thrown into those lime kilns to be burnt down for plaster. But we're going to go first to the big exception. To our right is a little hill, and on that hill is the most intact Doric temple in all of Greece. This temple is dedicated to the god Hephaestus. Hephaestus is the crippled god of smiths, ironworkers, bronze workers, pyrotechnicians who work with fire to melt metal and create armor, statues, jewelry, tools. There are still metal works around the area of the Agora, as there have been for literally thousands of years. He was their god. This was his temple. And because it was made in the 7th century of our era, a church of St. George, yes, that St. George of the Dragon, it's still intact, except for the fact that you'll see some of the statuary that looked pagan and idolatrous had its heads and defining features knocked off. About the only thing you can still recognize is up at the southeast corner as you stand facing the main door, you will see the Minotaur of the Theseus myth up there on the level of the metapiece. But it's intact. There is the whole cella of the temple, the internal building, enclosed by its original walls. You can look up and see the lofty coffers, those sort of hollowed out spaces built in stone that connected the colonnade back to the central area that had the statue of the god and his sister Athena, a goddess of crafts, also side by side inside this temple. One of the beauties to me of the Hephaestion, the temple of Hephaestus, is that outside are shrubs. It was found when they excavated the rock that there were holes there in rows that matched the rows of columns. And it now turns out that the colonnades were carried further out with lines of shrubs or lines of small trees to echo the columns in one of the world's oldest examples of definite landscaping. Many other buildings and fragments remain of our agora. This is where Socrates used to walk. In these shattered remains, we can picture him strolling, arguing, learning from the craftsmen, and we should end our visit to the agora by going into that great reconstructed Stoa of Attalus, reconstructed with American funds from John D. Rockefeller himself, and look at the grand museum of the Athenian democracy, both things to do with the government and the democratic workings, and also things to do with ordinary life. One of my favorite objects in this museum is a potty chair for an ordinary Athenian baby, made out of pottery from the ceramic quarter and still surviving in fragments to be pieced together and put in this wonderful museum. As we begin to exit the agora and head out into the new agora of Athens, that great plaka, which is the commercial center of the modern city for small shops and the kind of street life that the agora was all about, let's take one look back at our Acropolis. And look up there, almost where we began, near the east end, at some caves. One of those caves is called the Cave of Aglaros, a mythical heroine of ancient Athenian history, who's commemorated in that cave. Every year, the cadets of Athens, to inaugurate themselves as the new generation of the defenders of the city, would go up to that cave and take what was called the ephebic oath. They were ephebes, young men defending their city. And in that oath, they swore that they would defend their country, its fields, its sacred olive trees, and that they would hand it on not less, but greater than they received it. I hope that the experience of walking around through even the shattered remnants of that city that those young men swore to defend will convince you that for generation after generation, all Athenians were true to that oath.